Welcome back, everyone, to the main stage where we have our next speaker. So I am very delighted to introduce Emily from the University of Law, who'll be sharing a fascinating presentation. We've been speaking backstage, so I'm looking forward to this one. So Emily, over to you.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. So my name's Emily Roach, and I'm a tutor at the University of Law's Leeds and Sheffield campus. I am bisexual. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm looking forward to taking you on a bit of a journey through the law, the case law, and the legislation that has impacted LGBT people throughout British history. And I am starting as early as the 16th century with Henry VIII, and you might be wondering, well, what on earth does that have to do with LGBTQIA mental health in the workplace today? And I promise you, if this is madness, there is method in it, and hopefully it will all become clear in due time. So to start then thinking, first of all, about the criminalisation of gay and bisexual men, it's really important to understand that landscape to give this context to the importance of being your authentic self in the workplace and some of the struggles that LGBTQIA people have had to be their authentic selves in the past. So Henry VIII might be a familiar figure to you. You might understand Henry VIII as having initiated the English Reformation, where he appointed himself supreme head of the Church of England and dissolved many covenants and monasteries. Or you might be familiar with Henry VIII as a result of his notorious love affairs. The two events were, of course, directly connected. You may know over the course of his life, he had 6 wives, 2 of whom were beheaded. So this deeply unpleasant monarch has also relevance to LGBTQIA communities and the legislation, the anti-LGBT legislation that has existed over the centuries. So Henry VIII in 1533 introduced a piece of legislation that criminalised intercourse between gay and bisexual men. And it's particularly important to recognise that this lasted, obviously, this had a very deep and very long legacy. It was an offence that was punishable by death, and the death penalty was only abolished in 1861 in the Offences Against the Person Act. But harsh penalties remained, a minimum of 10 years term imprisonment. And you might think that this mid-19th century act, this Offences Against the Person Act, might represent something of a very tentative step towards progress. But in fact, the opposite is true. Shortly after the Offences Against the Person Act, we have the Criminal Law Amendment Act in 1885. And what this did was this extended the activities that gay and bisexual men could be prosecuted and jailed for, and it included private acts. And this is very important. It's necessary, I think, to understand the consequences of the way that anti-LGBT legislation extended into private space. Think of having to organise your home in a way that meant that any casual visitor wouldn't perhaps be able to see any evidence of a relationship that was anything other than platonic. Think of the way that we maybe have our homes constructed today with photographs on our mobile phones, pictures of people that we love, and think about having to hide any evidence of that when it comes to your same-sex partner. In fact, this piece of legislation was famously thought of as the blackmailer's charter. It was often used to prosecute somebody for the most minor of offences. Oscar Wilde, the novelist and poet, was famously prosecuted under this piece of legislation. And it could be something as simple as a letter that contained some affectionate language between two men. So it was a really, really low bar to prosecution. And I think, again, that's a really important thing to understand. And it wasn't until nearly a century later that the criminalisation of homosexuality was properly discussed. And this arose largely as a result of several high-profile convictions, including, you may be familiar with the mathematician Alan Turing, who was part of a broader era of moral panic, which we know as the Lavender Scare. Now, the Lavender Scare is all connected to the Cold War, a period roughly around the 1940s and 1950s, where there was a link fostered between lesbian and gay individuals and communism, which positioned lesbian and gay people as enemies of the state. Again, that might sound fairly astonishing today, but this was only in the 1950s that this was happened. And so what you start to see is you see gay and bisexual men during this era of heightened moral panic, during this Cold War period, being prosecuted as enemies of the state, as spies who are actively working against the state. The government idea being that somehow bisexual and gay men would be more prone to manipulation. And so we have a really difficult time for many gay and bisexual men during this period. So you then have, after Alan Turing's death by suicide, Alan Turing was prosecuted, and as I said, he was not only prosecuted, but he was also forced to undergo a process of chemical castration, and then later died by suicide. And so this prompted, along with another couple of high-profile cases, a discussion to take place in an investigation into the criminalisation of homosexuality. And this was the findings of this report were outlined in the Wolfenden report, which suggested that actually private acts between two men should not be criminalised. It was not the role of the court, the function of the legislature to invade into the private homes of individuals. And it's only 10 years after that report and that was published and those recommendations were made that we actually do start to see the first kind of meaningful step towards progress in the Sexual Offences Act 1967, which partially decriminalised homosexuality by permitting two men to be together in private. However, let's pause again on that word. The courts at the time took a very, very broad, thought very broadly about what it meant to be in private space. And actually, after the Sexual Offences Act 1967 was implemented, policing of gay and bisexual men increased, and it increased substantially by 400% in the 1970s. And this stipulation that the relationships could only take place in private was often the means to prosecution. So think of gay and bisexual men who shared their homes with flatmates, for example. They were not considered to be in private. Men could be prosecuted under old Victorian laws for crimes such as licentious dancing. There was no ability to hold hands or to kiss or do anything like that in the streets. And in the 1970s, as a result of this, you see many of the activist groups starting to emerge, such as the Gay Liberation Front, who really resist this, really resist this idea of having to be closeted, having to be hidden away, and they stage various protests, such as public coming out events, protests, marches that we now think of today as Pride, and high-profile kiss-ins, they were called, where people would kind of gather in a public place and same-sex couples would kiss in public. And a large part of that strategy was to try to change the hearts and minds of people and to try to see, to try to get the general public to start to see that LGBT people existed. So you then have the path to progress with any progressive movement is never a straight line. It goes from bad to it gets better, and there's nothing in between. It's always sort of, if you think about it, like a series of peaks and troughs. We go forward a bit, we move back a bit, and then we go forward again. And the Local Government Act 1988, Section 28 specifically marked a step back, where the legislation prohibited any discussion relating to homosexuality in schools and in local government departments. And this had a significant consequence, which I'll mention in a moment. You then see greater progress with the Human Rights Act, which, of course, was deeply important for LGBTQIA people and recognised a number of fundamental human rights. You see an important case that comes before the courts in 1999 that related to the ability to be a gay, bisexual or lesbian and serve in the army, in the armed forces or the merchant navy. The Sexual Offences Act partially decriminalised homosexuality, but it didn't extend to people serving in the army or indeed in the merchant navy. And it was only in the Smith and O'Grady case in 1999, that's not very long ago at all, that prohibition or that restriction was actually lifted. And then, of course, you get these steps forward that you might be more familiar with in the Civil Partnerships Act, the fight for marriage equality, and further pieces of progressive legislation. I think it's also important just to touch on the final bullet point on this slide, colonialism and pursuit of the British Empire. It's important to recognise that Henry VIII in his legislation that criminalised relationships between men did not just impact Britain. Because of colonialism and because of the British Empire, that legislation was actually enforced and brought into other nations. So with transgender individuals, there are also specific laws. So it was possible prior to the 1970s to make informal changes to official documents, but it wasn't really something that had any kind of formal seal of approval. So official documents you could make changes to if your assigned gender at birth was inconsistent with your gender. Then we have this unhelpful case of Corbett and Corbett, which actually said that that was no longer possible. And that meant that for transgender individuals, there was no way of kind of formally recognizing their gender in a way that was appropriate or consistent with the way that they were living their lives. And so that presented huge challenges, which again, we see some protections coming into place in the Human Rights Act. And then very importantly, the Gender Recognition Act comes into play, which enables transgender individuals to actually change the sex that they have been assigned at birth on official documents such as a birth certificate. However, it does have its limitations, and the European Commission in 2002 actually ranked the GRA procedure as amongst the worst in Europe because of the intrusive medical requirements, and there is an excessively long waiting list for transgender people to go through that process. The length of time it takes is substantial, it is significant, and that's why reforms to the Gender Recognition Act are much talked about at the moment. In the workplace, we then, of course, have this very important piece of legislation in the Equality Act 2010, which not only protects LGBT individuals, but it also recognises gender reassignment as a protected characteristic. And then in 2020, we have this Taylor and Jaguar Land Rover case that rules that non-binary identities fall under gender reassignment for the purposes of the Equality Act. And so how does this this kind of history of legislation link into everything, link into mental health in the workplace? Well, for me, I think as part of my own personal story, but I also think in general, it comes down to the closet and invisibility. You can see here a quote from Sylvia Rivera: "We have to do this. We have to fight for equality because we can no longer stay invisible. We have to be visible. We should not be ashamed of who we are." And of course, throughout history, you see an erasure of LGBT lives throughout history. You see transgender individuals will have been incorrectly remembered or dead named in things like death certificates, reports of their death, medical records, media reports, and so on. And you also see inaccurate representations of relationships between individuals as well, particularly at the time at which relationships between men would have been a criminal offence. Interestingly, you might be wondering, well, what about relationships between women? What was the position there? Well, in 1921, Parliament did actually debate around criminalising relationships between women, but they actually felt it applied to such a small section of the society. They decided not to take it any further. They were actually worried about the fact that if they introduced specific legislation, It might encourage women to investigate the possibility of a same-sex relationship. And so they wanted to keep it as quiet as possible. And they didn't want to call attention to the fact that lesbian and bisexual women existed. And they thought by enshrining something in the law, they would do so. They would call attention to this, and this would become a big problem that they would then have to deal with, which is again, quite astonishing, isn't it? And we continue to see this invisibility throughout, even into the 1990s, where spaces, LGBTQIA spaces, gay bars most notably, would use curtains and blacked out windows until as early as the 1990s, because of all of those restrictions about there being kind of any public displays of affection, and how heavily stigmatized that was. You then also have Section 28 further perpetuating the invisibility of LGBTQIA lives, because we were simply absent from the school curriculum, from school libraries. There weren't the books that you could go and find and pick up and see yourself represented. Absent during the height of the AIDS crisis from personal, social and health education and so on. It is a privilege to have a recorded history, and if you are a member of a marginalised group, there will often be holes and gaps in the history of how in the history of people that existed and shared some of your experiences, because people have not written the history of particularly people who hold a number of different marginalized identities on account of gender, sexuality, race, and so on. And so we have this invisibility. We have LGBTQIA people feeling invisible or being invisible in important places like the school curriculum that will go on to inform our views and our thoughts and ideas in the future. Those spaces that could normalize LGBTQIA experience were simply just pretending that LGBTQIA people didn't exist. And this is where we come to the idea of the closet and the impact that has on people. Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick describes the closet as the defining structure for gay oppression. And Michael Warner's quote, the more people are isolated or privatized, the more vulnerable they are to the unequal effects of shame. It's that word shame that a lot of this is getting at. The more that you are told that you have to exist only in private, you have to exist kind of on the margins of what society, legislature, schools, the books that we read, what they deem to be acceptable or normal, the more that you are told that you should exist outside of those things, the more shame that you will feel. And that then in turn has a deep consequence on mental health. And so clear connections have been drawn by multiple researchers working in mental health between poor mental health and the experience of being in the closet and being unable to live openly as LGBTQIA. And of course, in keeping with this session today, living as your authentic self. And research has shown that a significant proportion of LGBTQIA people go back into the closet when they go into a new job. And so the closet is itself this kind of sliding door. I'm not going to have a huge amount of time to talk about my story, only that I was a teenager growing up and going to school during Section 28. And so for me and for many of my peers, LGBTQIA people were simply invisible. The only narratives we had of LGBTQIA experience existed in the tabloid press that demonized and vilified gay and bisexual men that were dying of HIV/AIDS. And so when that is the only thing that you see and that is the only representation you see, it can be actually very hard to work out who you are yourself. And indeed, in my year at school and then later at university, there was nobody of my year group that was openly out. And it was only much later that a number of us sort of met and talked and spoke about that experience of being in the closet during those really formative and important years of your life. In the workplace, then, it was, I felt it would be easier to not discuss who I was or to discuss my bisexuality. I felt somehow that people might be put off by it. People might not want to hear about it. They might think that I was sharing too much personal information about myself. Oh, we don't want to hear about that. We don't need to know about that. And it became very clear to me over time that actually the way that I was going to be the happiest in the workplace and the way that I was going to be happiest in the office was to live as my authentic self, to come out and to try and share something of my story with people who perhaps hadn't had the same experiences in order to try to foster this culture of understanding. And in fact, it's really common for people to go back into the closet when they go into the workplace, when they perhaps leave what might seem a safer space, perhaps of university, and then go into the workplace. And it's really important that employers recognize this and take active steps to combat it. So almost 2 in 5 bisexual people aren't out to anyone at work. And it certainly took me time. Myself, I can say that speaks to my experience. I waited until I was in a position where I felt comfortable within the workplace itself. This was when I was practicing as a lawyer, I should say, not at the University of Law. But I waited until a time at which I felt comfortable in my own position within the workplace to come out. So you can see there these statistics, and I'm sure you've heard a number of these today. You have this, the fact that bisexual people experience this double closet, and you have a number of quite high statistics and high rates of LGBT staff either feeling they have to hide or disguise that they're LGBT because they're afraid of discrimination. And when you look back at the legislative history and the way that the law has treated LGBT people and the way that the law privileges marriage and has talked historically, obviously not today, about marriage as a union between a man and a woman, and has thought in those very traditional kind of conservative terms, it's not surprising that people perhaps feel nervous or scared or worried about being their authentic selves and living their LGBT identities in the workplace. Of course, the Equality Act has been hugely significant because it's provided LGBT employees protection from discrimination, harassment and victimization. And there's significant progress, but the Stonewall Work Report suggests there's much more to be done. I think one of the things that is essential is for workplaces to foster a climate of meaningful allyship, because the burden of labour often falls on marginalised groups to defend, advocate and educate about their own experiences. And although it's very important to allow people to speak to their own experiences, when it comes to workplace discrimination and so on, there is a huge role that can be played by allies, just literally to let LGBTQIA employees know that you are safe in this space and that I'm a safe person to talk to if you are experiencing anything at work. So that's really all I had to say. I'm conscious that I did want to leave just 5 minutes or so for questions. But I hope that just that very, very quick overview of legislative history that has left LGBTQIA people existing on the margins, has left us feeling invisible, has left us feeling what Michael Warner describes as those unequal impacts of shame, all kind of help to contextualize where some of these anxieties around being your authentic self in the workplace have come from. They have a deep history, and today I'm delighted to see so many employers really addressing that and really providing that space where people feel more comfortable in the workplace. And certainly, based on my own experience, I would encourage you, if you're safe to do so, to do so within the workplace, because it will have an enormous mental health benefit if you are able to feel free to be who you are and not have to hide or to make private those relationships and those experiences that it's so important that we normalize in our society today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. Amazing. I think it's fascinating, isn't it, when you go back and you say, "Oh, I'm starting in the 16th century," and you think, "Gosh, that's ages and ages and ages ago. But then you realise when you look at it, 2003 Section 28 was abolished. Like, that is not long ago. And we had someone this morning who said, they reference their partner and they're getting engaged, and only in 2014 equal marriage passed. So you look back and you think, yeah, these laws must have been introduced years and years and years ago. They must have been abolished years and years and years ago. When actually we're looking around the 2000s, for a lot of change. And I think changing laws is one thing, but then of course it's the hearts and minds piece that comes with it. And what you've picked up on, I think, is so important. And I just want to sort of say now where you're at then. So clearly you've got this incredible knowledge around our history, and we're looking at the stats around what more can be done. But what do you think are some of the biggest changes that we need to see happen, I guess, within 2021 within the UK? Because we are seeing on the news, hate crimes going up and violence going up. So what is it you think that workplaces can do, but then can also impact society to make a change for the community?
Yeah, I think workplaces knowing, advocating, having allies that advocate for LGBTQIA individuals using, say, pronouns in email signatures, things like that, I think is really important, because there might still very well, in fact, there probably are still people who are in the closet in the workplace, and it might give them, might make them feel that actually they're safe to actually come out and to be in the workplace as their authentic selves. I mean, I think in terms of legislation, I've always said, I've been saying for several years now that the fight for transgender equality is the biggest fight of our time, as far as I'm concerned, as an LGBTQIA community. And I think that's really where the legislation has been, that the hearts and minds is further behind, I think. And I think you're seeing a lot of narratives that I think reflect some of the narratives that we saw around gay men in the 80s, for example. And I think it's really important to be educated on trans experience and to understand how much further the legislation can go to make that process less challenging for transgender individuals to be able to, again, live as themselves. People just want to be who they are, and there's so many important consequences, mental health benefits to that. I think it's just really important that the law kind of catches up and enables that to happen. I feel like we're perhaps in a space of a bit of moral panic with that at the minute, which we see a lot with LGBTQIA progress or non-progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know when people stop hiding their identity at the front door, ultimately they can focus on the job at hand, and is it that much of an ask for someone to want to be themselves in the workplace? A few questions, and you've covered some of them off actually, but someone mentioned, that's so interesting, great background, thank you. But what do you think students can do to help increase those statistics in the future? So I think they mean, we can see the stats now, positive that change has happened, but actually when you see the stats where people not being out, what do you think the generation now and people on this call can be doing to support?
Well, I mean, I suppose one of the obvious things is to come out, but I always feel that that's a bit of a nuance point, isn't it? Because I would never also want to force people who felt uncomfortable about coming out to come out, and you must only do so if you're comfortable with that, if you're comfortable about having conversations with someone perhaps of a different generation who might not understand your experience, and you feel sort of in a position to be able to have those conversations. I think it's not just as simple as, oh, well, everyone could come out and then those statistics would be different. And then, but I do think that if you feel comfortable talking about your experience, and that's something that you are able to do and you are safe to be out, then I think if you can resist that impulse of going back into the closet in the workplace and get involved with the societies within many workplaces now have LGBTQIA organisations within the workplace, and get involved in those staff networks from an early stage and become an advocate for other people in the workplace. And perhaps little signs, sometimes I might wear a rainbow pin or something like that to let people know, not only in my case I'm saying I'm a member of the community, but also perhaps to denote allyship as well can be helpful.
Absolutely. And I guess one question from me is, are you part of a community at the University of Law? Do they have one? Are you an active member?
Yes, yeah. So we've got a staff network, which is great. And we've also got a very active student network. The student network's been instrumental in actually bringing professionals within the legal profession in to speak at various different events, and many of whom have got to a very high level within the legal profession, and some incredible experiences we've heard about people, for example, who transitioned whilst they were in the workplace. And so we've heard stories and experiences like that. And that's been incredibly powerful. And the student organisation have been fantastic in organising a lot of that.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily, for sharing that with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the time.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.